Good evening and welcome to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I am Robert Spencer, and we continue yet again this week with our series of interviews with some of the nation's prominent and foremost freedom fighters. I'm very happy to say that we have with us again tonight Raymond Ibrahim, the author of The Al-Qaeda Reader and of the brand new book Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians, which is available now at any self-respecting bookstore and at Amazon.com. Raymond, of course, is a Middle East and Islam specialist, a Shulman Fellow with the David Horowitz Freedom Center, Associate Fellow at the Middle East Forum. He has given lectures all over the country at the National Defense Intelligence Conference, the U.S. Strategic Command, the Defense Intelligence Agency. He's got a rap sheet as long as your arm. And we are very happy to have him with us tonight. Raymond, welcome.
Hey, Robert. Thanks for having me. Happy to be with you again.
Indeed. It's my pleasure. And Raymond, this book that you have, Crucified Again, this is an extremely important topic, and I think that it cannot be emphasized enough how important this is. The Muslim persecution of Christians is something that is escalating all over the world today. It is getting very scant attention from the political authorities, from the mainstream media, from the human rights organizations, and yet it is really reaching epidemic proportions. Can you give us a little capsule summary, just to begin with, of the kinds of things that are happening in the world today that I think most people are not aware of?
Sure. Everything you say is absolutely correct. This matter of Muslim persecution of Christians is really it's a humanitarian crisis at this point, and it's something that, as you pointed out, is little known of, little heard of, little acted upon. And in fact, as we talk, you'll see how even the Obama administration, not only is it ignoring it, but it's actually exacerbating and making it worse, a la the Arab Spring and other matters. But it's the amazing thing is, as you're alluding to, is how the mainstream media has all but obfuscated and just made it into a non-issue. And of course, the reason for that is because this is one of those things that will really throw a wrench in the liberal mainstream narrative, the philosophical narrative. In other words, when we talk about violence, when you look at the TV and the mainstream media and the way it's always presented, violence and anger and hostility must always be rationalized as some sort of grievance. It's a lack of education, it's ignorance, it's poverty, it's any number of things, because that's the mainstream narrative. It can't be some sort of intrinsic thing. It can't be evil, because of course we don't believe in that sort of thing. That's very antiquated to talk about such things. And so when you talk about Muslim persecution of Christians, unlike any other form of Muslim intolerance, it really stands out, because if Muslims launch rockets at Israel and scream Allah Akbar, if Muslims riot in Europe and burn and destroy, if Muslims do any number of things, that's easy for the mainstream media and all the pundits, the liberal ones, to get by, because it'll always be articulated as a matter of just oppressed, angry Muslims lashing out, and who can blame them? They're so frustrated. In Israel, obviously Israel is stronger than Palestinians, so they have no recourse but to resort to terrorism and violence. In Europe, Muslims are minorities. Obviously, they're oppressed, they're ostracized, so no wonder they're doing what they're doing. But when you come to this matter of, this persecution of Christians and really other people, but as we can talk along, you'll see it's really the Christians are the number one victims. When you come to this matter, it's very hard for the mainstream media and the liberal narrative to get by, because now you're talking about people who are being persecuted absolutely for no other reason than that they are Christians. Okay, because these people, let's say the Copts in Egypt, for one example, they're Egyptians just like the Muslims. They look the same. You can't tell the difference between a Muslim and a Copt, from their physical appearance. They look the same. Of course, it's because the vast majority of Egyptian Muslims were originally Copts, their forebears, before they were compelled to convert for various reasons throughout the medieval era. But so they're the same race. They speak the same language. They're the same. They have the same culture. You cannot tell a Copt from a Muslim apart in Egypt in any way, shape, or form, other than maybe seeing a cross on the wrist of a Copt or seeing them go into church. So we're talking about identical people, and yet all over the Islamic world, they're being attacked, killed. Their churches are being bombed. I spoke about the cops. We can move to Nigeria. Again, same race, same people, same language, indistinguishable from their Muslim counterparts. Yet not a Sunday goes by without churches being bombed over there. So how can the mainstream narrative really talk about that as opposed to the other examples I gave about, for instance, Muslims, fighting against Israel or in the West, and 9/11 even was articulated as by the mainstream media as well. Look, they're angry for all our sins and what we've done, and they're retaliating. But this issue of attacking people who are identical to Muslims in every single shape, way, and form, except religion, just is so difficult to try to get by. And of course, the mainstream media gets by it in any number of ways. The most easiest way, of course, is not to talk about it, not to mention it. And yet, even when they have to mention it, for instance, the more spectacular attacks like the Baghdad bombing, the one that killed nearly 60 people in 2010, or the Alexandria bombing that killed 23 people, or the Nigerian Christmas and Easter bombings that kill each one about 50 people. So the mainstream media has to talk about it. But when you read it, when you look at the headlines, they'll state the fact in one sentence or two. A church was attacked by unnamed, unknown people. And then it'll go on about how the Christians retaliated and how they got angry and they might have attacked and even killed a Muslim and there was violence. And in the end, you just walk away thinking it's sectarian strife. It's two equal groups that are just intolerant of each other. And it has absolutely nothing to do with, Islam or Islamic teachings. So
I find that's very common, isn't it? It seems like at Jihad Watch, when I cover these things day by day and month after month and year after year, it seems so often that attacks by Muslims against Christians are represented as ethnic strife, or even when they say that it's Muslims and Christians fighting each other, there's a tremendous tendency to portray it as if it is both sides are equally to blame. And this seems to be something that they are purposely doing, because in case after case after case, I see that you read the story and it's Muslims attacking Christians. And sometimes the Christians are fighting back, sometimes not. But then the whole thing is represented as if the Christians are just as much at fault as the Muslims.
Right. And that's what always happens. Recently in Egypt, I mean, there's so on Jihad Watch, you yourself see all of this happening, all the different headlines. And recently in Egypt, a church was attacked, and bullets were open, fire was open on it, this and that. And then the headline I read, I forget right now, which it was mainstream media, was just sectarian clash in Egypt. And you read it, and you don't even know who started it. You don't know what's going on, and if you don't know any better, like most people in America or in the West in general, and you take the media's word, it just sounds like, two different sects or ethnicities are fighting. Yeah. And this has such a long paper trail. I mean, consider Sudan. I remember, the Sudan war went a long time ago, back when we were all younger and when I wasn't as involved in this field. And I too remember I would read it, and it didn't say anything about religion. It was the Arab North, fighting the black African South. Right. And in reality, they're both Africans. The Arab North is called Arab because it's Muslim, and they speak Islam's language, and they name Arab Islamic names, and that's it. And that was really the fundamental aspect to it. And yet you speak to any well-informed person, it had nothing to do with religion. It was all about, land and resources and this and that. And the same thing with Lebanon. The Lebanese war, you don't get, when you read it, the mainstream narrative, that really at root it was Islamic supremacists trying to subjugate the Christians. It was again presented as economic issues. Yeah. And so it's amazing how it's being so dissembled by the mainstream media and of course politicians.
Well, what do you think's in it for them? Why on earth does there seem to be, and there obviously does seem to be, this concerted effort? I mean, you mentioned Sudan. I remember in those days that Omar Bashir, the leader of Sudan, actually said straight out that this was a jihad that they were waging against the Christians of the South. And that was mentioned once. I saw it in one report, put it up at Jihad Watch. That was that. And nobody else seems to pick up on it. There was no examination of the implications of the statement. What on earth are they trying to do? Why is it so imperative on the part of the mainstream media? Why do they think that it's so important that they obfuscate these things? Another one, just briefly, is that I see a lot in mainstream media reports about this, is the use of passive voice or the
Yeah.
absence of an actor altogether. Like they say, a bomb exploded in a church, or a church was severely damaged by a bomb, but
Yeah.
no hint
It
of
just
who might have
happened.
set the bomb off.
Right.
It
It
just
just
it just
happened to be
happened to
there.
be
Some
there.
bomb came out of nowhere.
Yeah. So
I,
what on
I
earth?
mean,
What's the
the reason,
objective?
yeah. The objective, I mean, there's so many different kinds, and I mean, I think every different journalist is under different, has a different motivation, conscious or unconsciously. But I think one of the biggest one is it's a sort of it's ironic to me because liberals, if you think about liberals or people who are multicultural, people who praise multiculturalism, which would be, let's say, the mainstream media and the liberal narrative, if you really think about what they're doing in the context of what you and I are talking about, it is so arrogant and so Western cultural centric, even
Yeah,
though they're
yeah.
the ones who say, you see what I'm saying? Because what they're doing is they have an idea of how the world works, which we alluded to earlier, which is basically, violence is never an intrinsic thing. It's a reflection of some grievance. And that's just a philosophical number one premise, and they build everything on that premise. But when you think about it, think of how culturally arrogant that is. You and I will agree that Muslims are doing what they're doing because it is distinct to their civilization, let's say, or in the Islamic teachings and doctrines. We can understand that, and in that sense, we are actually giving them their due. In fact, we're respecting them. But when we're respecting them as people and as who they are and what they believe. But when you come to this liberal narrative, what they're really doing is they're saying, no, 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 I don't care what they say. I don't care if they do a fatwa about killing Christians or if they articulate it as a jihad. They really they don't mean that, or they don't.
Yes.
If only we could help them and give them more money and resources, I'm sure all that will fall away. So consider the arrogance involved in that. It's basically saying my epistemology of how things work is really the whole world's epistemology, and the only difference is these people are still a little backwards, and once they see the light, once they understand the world I do, which is in a very materialistic sense, then surely they too will stop doing this. So
Oh,
I think that is
absolutely.
a big part of it, and it's arrogance. This
It's
is the
very
amazing thing. They're the
important.
ones who praise. Yeah,
It's a
they're
huge
the ones who
important
are
point,
praising.
Raymond.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
reminded of something that I put up at Jihad Watch today. Of course, the day that this airs is going to be, this will be a few weeks in the past, but we are taping today, whatever day it is, April 4th, and there is this interview in Wired, the online magazine, of Omar Hamami, the American jihadist from Alabama, who is fighting jihad in Somalia. And Spencer Ackerman of Wired, who is the leftist journalist who did a series of exposés a few years back. You may remember, Raymond, who he was the guy who suddenly discovered that FBI training materials and training materials for Homeland Security and for Joint Terrorism Task Force and so on were full of the truth about Islam and jihad, including writings by you and by me. And he was able to start off this whole firestorm in the media, which ultimately led the Obama administration to purge the truth about Islam and jihad from all the training materials. But in any case, today he's interviewing Omar Hamami, and he says, what is an example of a current jihad Khalifa pursuit done right way? And the jihadist Omar Hamami answers, well, it's fighting is part of the religion, and Spencer Ackerman can't handle that. And he says, fighting is part of your religion, you mean, or the U.S. religion, in quotes, lurking behind the foreign policy? And Omar Hamami says it again, U.S. policy is the factor defining specific target, but fighting is part of the religion. And so Spencer Ackerman still won't get it, refuses to get it, and comes back and says, so would it be correct to understand you feel compelled to fight given U.S. foreign policy? Well, no, it's not about U.S. foreign policy at all. This guy's trying to tell him, I'm fighting because of my religion. But Spencer Ackerman, the leftist journalist, just cannot, will not accept that, and continues to press him to say, no, I'm just fighting because of U.S. foreign policy. It's a quintessential example of what you're saying, that these analysts in the West are imposing their view of these things onto the jihadis, which is a very arrogant, ethnocentric, paternalistic thing to do.
Right. And they're the ones who are claiming we can't be this way, we have to be taught, we have to accept all cultures are equal. Think about that. Isn't that the whole idea of multiculturalism, this
Yeah.
relevancy that all cultures are equal? Well, if that's the case, then you should believe that that is their culture. And yet it seems like, they can't transcend their own box. They're in a box. They think in a box. This is what they believe. And anything out of that box is not real. I don't care how many times you insist it, and how many times you say it. I don't care how much documentation you show me. One way or another, you're going to have to see it my way because my way is the right way. And look at the arrogance in that. And yet, so you and I actually, who might be accused of, not of being the opposite, not being multicultural, we're the ones who are actually giving them their due. We take them at their word. I believe them. I respect them enough to believe that what they say is what they believe. And so look at this grand irony. And now you got these people who are in charge of informing the West and America about what's going on, and yet they just can't even escape their own thought patterns. And I mean, like you're saying, how many times do these jihadists, how many times must they articulate it nonstop, what they believe, what they're doing, and quote it. And yet, no, we still, we don't get it. That can't be. Like you're saying, he has to somehow pin it on American foreign policy. He can't just take his, and here he is, he's saying it. He's saying, no, this is our teaching. It's the same thing with Al-Qaeda, as I did in the Al-Qaeda reader. I mean, time and again, when they're speaking to Muslims, they point out, in the end, America is our enemy, irrespective of what foreign policies they follow, because our religion teaches, and they write this, every infidel has three choices: either submit to the sword of Islam, or convert, or become a dhimmi, or go to war. And this thing has been spoken for 1,400 years.
Yes.
And we have documentation of it, like a long paper trail, miles long. And yet here we are, and we just don't get it. We can't transcend our own liberal, material. And this is the other part. It's a very materialistic worldview that the West subscribes to, which is to say that anything that is other than material, metaphysical, which would be, for instance, ideologies like jihadi ideology, is not real. All that is real is the physical, the tangible. And so what they're saying can't be real, because obviously what is real is they're angry about something tangible, which is land and territory, let's say vis-a-vis Israel.
Yes.
That's why that narrative makes perfect sense with the media, for instance.
And so not only is the truth not allowed, but if you speak the truth, then you're a hateful, Islamophobic, anti-Muslim, racist bigot.
Right. And that's the level we've gotten to now, where, speaking the truth, the truth doesn't matter anymore. Okay. What matters is that you say what's right, what's politically correct. I mean, it all boils down to really political correctness. And so because of this political correctness, as you well know, we are completely paralyzed. And,
Yeah,
facts don't matter. Who cares about it? Because, hey, your truth is not his truth. That whole sort of whacked out post-existential type thinking. And so now there's no truth. It's basically what I say, what you say, what I feel, what you feel, what they feel. And we can't go from there. And it amazes me. And I really discuss this in my book, Crucified Again. In the beginning, I have a chapter called Lost History. And I really discuss how, so much of what's happening to Christians today, and that's a big part of the book, I demonstrate the continuity. So I show, for instance, the historical forms of persecution, let's say church attacks, abduction of women, apostasy attacks, this and that, and I document them throughout history. And then I show what's happening today, and it's identical. It is, you feel like you're reading the same exact story, the same pattern, mirror, identical. And so here we have this vast continuity. And they're saying that what happened in the 7th century is what's happening in the 21st century. And yet, and if you would have spoken to someone a couple of hundred years ago, a European, if you would have spoken to a child, he would understand. It's common sense. And this is the problem. We've jettisoned common sense, because common sense, it might say something that's not right or wrong. And so we can't talk about it. As you know, that one, there was a recent hearing. This always amazes me because it's so surreal. I know you're familiar, you might know the names, but it was a hearing, and there was some Obama administration from Homeland Security, and Lundgren, I think, was the chairman, and he kept asking him, okay, can you say that we are at war with radical Islamist extremism? Okay, he didn't say with Islam, and that man could not in any way, shape, or form, who was at the hearing, associate even Al-Qaeda. He wouldn't associate Al-Qaeda with a warped, perverse, radical Islamist interpretation. Okay. And so now, think of how there's no common sense. This man what he is saying is what a child from a few generations or centuries ago in the West would have caught up on way before he can. So here's a perfect example of the paralysis that's going on. And even at the hearing, you can see just the chairman just staring at him because he wouldn't give him. He asked him, you're probably familiar with this. He says about Nidal Hassan. He says he had a card that says "Soldier of Allah," and he goes, "Well, is that an indicator?" Because he said "Soldier of Allah" that this is a radical Islamist extremism, and he wouldn't even concede to that. So it's just it's amazing the lack of common sense that we now have, and that our top leaders and analysts, and of course the mainstream media, are peddling, which has resulted in an alternate reality. So now
Okay.
what you see and what you read mainstream media has nothing to do with reality. It's
But
the
the
antithesis of it
mainstream
in many
media,
ways.
okay, I understand that the mainstream media might be guided by this ridiculous sense of multiculturalism that works from this constant paradigm that non-white, non-Western, non-Christian people are always the victims and can't ever be portrayed as anything but the victims, and that they run every news story through this paradigm. And this is one of the reasons why they obfuscate the persecution of Christians by Muslims. But Raymond, what about the government? I mean, I am very well familiar with the things that you're discussing, and there are many others. I can recall Thomas Perez, who was in Homeland Security at that time, or the Defense Department, one of them. In any case, he's now the Secretary of Labor, and he was confronted by a legislator who asked him if he would guarantee that he was the Assistant Attorney General, I believe it was. In any case, he was asked if he could guarantee that the U.S. would never try to, the Obama administration would never try to bring in laws criminalizing criticism of a religion. Because, of course, we know the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, has undertaken a massive years-long effort to try to compel the United States and the West to criminalize criticism of Islam. And Thomas Perez would not assure the legislators that the Obama administration would never try to criminalize criticism of Islam.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know, I understand that the mainstream media, these leftist journalists, they don't really realize what they're dealing with or what they're getting into. But what on earth is the problem with the U.S. government? What is going on in the Obama administration?
Well, you asked a great question, which I actually address. It's one thing for the media, like you're saying, to do this because, well, they're the media, and it's one thing for the masses of Americans and Westerners to not know any better because they're dependent on the media. But when you come to the government and you come to the White House and the Obama administration, now we're talking about people who have access to the best and most accurate intelligence. Okay. So Obama need not be listening to CNN when it comes to Islam. Okay, he needs to be listening to the analysts, the intelligence that's coming forth. And I know, regardless of what the White House and the Obama administration may be, there's a lot of great workers in the intelligence community and that are faithfully working to actually, bring the true information. So the Obama administration has access to the kind of information that would make, I would believe, crystal clear what we're talking about, because it's supposed to be objective. Or at the very least, I mean, let's say a lot of these analysts are also affected by this sort of liberal paradigm. But I'm sure it's going to be a little better than, of course, watching CNN. So the Obama administration knows better. And yet, what are they doing? So what they're doing is, on the one hand, they are exploiting or taking advantage of the mainstream media narrative because they like it, of course. So they will further it. They will do this. They will maintain that narrative, because that's what everyone hears in America, and it works for them. But then, like you're saying, so why are they doing this? And then you think about, for instance, the Arab Spring. Okay, so the media portrayed that as this wonderful, great thing. I would think the Obama or the government would know better. I mean, there's a reason why for decades American politicians and presidents supported dictators. Okay, and the reason is they knew what the alternative would be. Everyone knew that. If the dictators go, who was the group that was always fighting against the autocrats? It was always the jihadis. It wasn't I mean, of course, there were liberal, secular-minded people throughout the Arab and Islamic world who don't like dictators either. But the governments and the West always was aware that it's known. I mean, you probably know the saying, one vote, one time, one ruler. And that's what would happen when you have a democracy with a radical Islamic person taking over, which is what we're seeing in the Arab Spring right now. So that was not something that wasn't known. And the Obama administration must have known that. And yet they wholesale used the liberal narrative that the Arab Spring is basically just all of these all the Arab world is again, it's that arrogance. The whole Arab world are revolting because they want to be just like us. They want liberal secular democracy. Once we get rid of Mubarak, once we get rid of Gaddafi, once we get rid of Assad, all of a sudden it'll become Jeffersonian democracy in the Middle East. Now, the mainstream media, of course, said that, but again, the government knows better than that. So what are they doing? Obviously, they have their agenda. They're enabling. In other words, they know what is going to happen. They know it's what we're seeing today in these countries where the Arab Spring has come, and now we're seeing it become a nightmare, especially for Christian people and minorities and women, and basically even Muslims who don't follow the jihadi Islamist agenda. And so everyone knew this, but they did it. And there's another point I'd like to add specifically about Barack Obama. It's ironic because when I think to myself, okay, let's stick to this Christian persecution idea. You probably know that it's really gotten worse progressively. Let's say it's always, of course, been there, but let's say starting around the 60s and the 70s, it started getting worse, and now it's reached a fever pitch. So in that sense, it's understandable that former American presidents would not have been really cognizant about the idea of Christian persecution, because during their era, it really wasn't happening anywhere near like it's happening now. During their era, even the government didn't have the sort of intelligence that we have now. I mean, there was no internet, for instance. So it's understandable. Now we come to Barack Obama, where we're living in an era where Christian persecution and jihadi activity is just so obvious. It's so open, and it's increased manifold compared to what it was in former generations. And then add on top of that, Barack Hussein Obama, the man, who is always portrayed as very intelligent, he was educated in Indonesian madrasas, Islamic schools, and his father is a Muslim from Kenya. Now, what that tells me is, at the very least, it tells me he, of all presidents, should have an intimacy with what's really happening in those countries. He should know better than, let's say, a George Bush, because he has personal acquaintance with these regions. He should know what's going on, even regardless of what intelligence communities tell him. And yet, of all presidents, he is the one.
Raymond, we're coming to the midway point. We've got to take a break. This is very important material about Obama, and we will return to it right after this. I am Robert Spencer, and this is ABN's Jihad Watch program. We're here with the renowned and notorious Raymond Ibrahim, and we'll be right back after this.
You are watching ABN.
Hi, this is David Wood from Jesus or Muhammad. As I'm sure you've heard, ABN has some significant financial needs. A lot of the equipment here is either outdated or damaged, and it's affecting the broadcast. I'll say ABN does a great job with what they have, but they could be doing much more if they had some newer equipment, some newer cameras. And so I encourage everyone to support the work that's going on here. We'd like to have more broadcasts, more shows, more programs, and we can only do that through financial donations. And so I encourage everyone out there to contribute whatever you can. And beyond all of this, apart from the technical needs, there's also the security needs, given the increase in threats. And so if ABN is going to continue carrying on this work, they're going to need your support, as they always have. And so as as we end out the year and you're thinking about where you'd like to donate, I don't think you'll find a better place than ABN.
evening and welcome back to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I am Robert Spencer and we're here with Raymond Ibrahim, who has a new book out called Crucified Again, about the persecution of Christians by Muslims in the Islamic world based on Islamic texts and teachings. Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians. Get yours, get 5 copies for your friends, relatives, neighbors. This is a message that needs to get out. It is not getting out. It is truth that needs to be told. The plight of these people is an international human rights scandal that is being ignored by the world human rights community. And Raymond, we were discussing before the break Barack Obama and how he, of all presidents, should know and certainly does know the realities of Islam, having been raised as a Muslim according to his school records in Indonesia, and by his own account, getting in trouble for making faces in Quran class. The Christian students in Indonesia didn't go to Quran class. And, you know, I'm not trying to say that Barack Obama is a secret Muslim or something like that, but there's no doubt that he has a Muslim background, and that clearly by the foreign policy that he's pursued, he has a great affection for, respect for, regard for Islam, seems to think that it's a good ordering for society. And so what does that mean vis-a-vis his attitude toward this persecution of Christians?
He, of all presidents, is the most who is indifferent to it, who wants to cover it up. He'll throw a couple of words here and there, but his again, you know them by their fruits, not their words. So whatever he says is one thing, but look at his actions by supporting, for instance, this Arab Spring. I mean, look at what he did in Libya. You know, we knew Al-Qaeda, not just radical Islamic jihadis, or Al-Qaeda, the group that attacked and killed Americans, was operating in Libya. And what did he do? He supported them. And the reward the U.S. got was, of course, the consulate attack and the killing of an ambassador and several other U.S. employees. And so, I mean, go figure. And it was done, and it was planned on September 11th. And then, of course, he tried to dissemble it and blame it on free speech once again by blaming it on the movie. But to just kind of like to highlight this issue of who and what I'm thinking, what I'm trying to say about Obama is that let's compare him quickly to George Bush. So George Bush went to liberate Iraq from Saddam Hussein. And I really believe that someone like George Bush, based on his background, i.e. absolutely no personal knowledge of, let's say, the Islamic world, would, of course, listen to his advisors and the mainstream media and just be convinced that once they get democracy, things will be fine. But now you go to Barack Obama, who, like you said, you know, he went to Islamic schools. He knows what's being taught. He understands the sort of supremacist theology involved. I compare him somewhat to myself in a bit, because I'm born and raised in the U.S., but my parents are from Egypt.
Raymond.
Well, you know.
But anyway, yes,
so my parents,
born in the U.S., yes, sir. Sorry for the levity. Go ahead.
Yeah. So born in the U.S., and my parents are from Egypt. Now, just based on that fact alone, I almost want to say I have an innate understanding, better than, of course, your average American, of that area. Of course, I've lived and visited it many times also, just like he's lived in Indonesia. So just on that alone, aside from, let's say, reading or studying or understanding, you know, the Islamic world, has imparted to me a more personal kind of acquaintance that I know, that I can't just say, oh, it's not real. So I'm convinced this sort of thing is this acquaintance is such that Obama has it as well. So he way more than Bush, who we can say naively was convinced that throwing Saddam Hussein would all of a sudden bring, you know, democracy and secularism. He knows better than that, and yet he did the same exact thing, and he's doing it. And despite all the evidence, we can say that at the time of the Iraq War, we really didn't know, because most of the Islamic world was already under dictatorships, et cetera. So we couldn't really say what will happen. You know, the examples were very small. But with Iraq, we've seen what happened to the Christians, for example. They've been decimated. Now that Iraq's been liberated, especially in 2004, I mean, almost like half the churches were bombed, and it continues going. So that more than half of the Christians are either gone or dead. So there was a paradigm and a precedent that someone like Obama should have been aware of. But instead of that, he just went wholesale supporting open jihadis everywhere. Look at in Syria. He's supporting the jihadis who just recently issued a fatwa telling the opposition they can rape Syrian women because, you know, they're infidels. And these are the people we, under the Obama administration, are supporting. So obviously, to go to your point, he has an agenda, or we can say either he just doesn't care about what the repercussions of minorities and women and every non-radical Muslim, or I mean, it might be even more nefarious than that, that he's basically trying to enable and empower. Because what we're seeing, this is the first step. The Arab Spring, if you follow what they're saying, in Egypt, in Libya, in all these countries, the idea isn't just to be liberated. The next idea is to combine and become a caliphate. And they say that all the time. This is, again, one of those things that they say as much as the West ignores.
Why
And so
don't you
that's the grand
explain
plan.
for the viewers who may not be familiar with the concept, tell us exactly what a caliphate is and what the implications of its reestablishment would be.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point. The caliphate, of course, it comes from the word khalifa, which just means successor. So after Muhammad died, Abu Bakr became the first khalifa or caliph. And so a caliphate is basically an empire that is run by the successor of Muhammad. And its ultimate function was basically expansion and growth. And this is why after Muhammad died and Abu Bakr, what did Abu Bakr do? He went and slaughtered all the Arabs who, once Muhammad died, they figured, okay, this Islam thing's done, we can leave it now. And Abu Bakr said no. And it's interesting, most people aren't aware of this, but you're probably familiar with the Ridda Wars, the apostasy wars.
Sure.
That occurred between 632 and 634 under Abu Bakr. And most people think it's just because these Arabs who are Muslims stopped being Muslim. It wasn't just that, actually. They said, we're willing to do your prayers, we're willing to even go along with the gag, but we don't want to pay the tithes anymore, the zakat. And that alone was enough for Abu Bakr to launch a massive jihad that saw tens of thousands of Arabs mutilated, crucified, and tortured to death because they wouldn't give money to empower the caliphate and make it grow and become stronger. And then after that, of course, the second caliph, Omar, went on he totally expanded, and it was under his reign that the jihad went into Egypt and Libya, all the way down eventually into Spain. And so the caliphate's function is to basically conquer non-Muslim territories. The caliph was actually, as you know, the 5 pillars of Islam, the most important basically is prayer and fasting. And the caliph he had a dispensation. He didn't have to do those things because he had to wage jihad every year. So if the time came for him to wage jihad, he doesn't have to do those things. So that highlights how important the idea behind the caliphate of waging jihad to subsume non-Muslim territories is. And that was the history of Islam.
Raymond, I should just add at this point that in traditional Sunni Islamic law, it is the caliph's responsibility to declare offensive jihad. And he has the obligation to declare offensive jihad at regular intervals. And if he doesn't, he can be removed from his position. Offensive jihad is simply that. It's declaring war on a non-Muslim state in order to bring it under the rule of Islamic law, to either to Islamize the people there or to subjugate them as dhimmis. And the caliph is the only one who is authorized to declare offensive jihad. All the jihads in the world today, and ever since the abolition of the caliphate in 1924 by the secular Turkish government, have been defensive. That's actually one of the things that confuses Western analysts, because they look at the writings of somebody like Osama bin Laden, as in your Al-Qaeda reader, and they see that he's explaining why they fight on the basis of all these grievances. And then they think, oh, if we just redress all these grievances, then the Muslims will love us and everything will be okay. But that's actually a tremendous misconception. Osama was retailing all the grievances in order to justify his jihad as defensive, because defensive jihad is an obligation on all Muslims, according to Islamic law, if an Islamic land is attacked. And offensive jihad, however, can only be declared by the caliph. So one of the main goals of the jihad movement worldwide is to reestablish the caliphate so that offensive jihad can be waged.
Exactly. So that is when they talk about a caliphate in the West, oh, what's wrong with that? They just want to be united. Just like we're a united bloc. We're the United States. Some Muslims will actually in Egypt will call, we want the united Islamic state. So they kind of euphemize and use these terms that the West thinks, hey, that sounds great. But in the end, what it is of course, is the caliphate. And the other option, or the other idea, when you were pointing out the caliph's job, of course, is to wage jihad, is, of course, that's only when he can. So now we're also at a point where Muslims are not in a position, aside from the technicality of not having a caliph, but they're just not physically and materially capable of actually going, let's say, into Europe and conquering it by arms. Okay, a full-on jihad. So what they are permitted to do, of course, is to have the hudna, or truces, with Israel, with everyone else, which are basically a truce that is, I'm going to go to peace with you. Palestinians are at peace with Israel. They have a peace treaty. Why? Because that's the best option for them, because they can't win anyway at an armed conflict. But once they can, of course, the hudna is abrogated and the jihad resumes. And all these little important things are just missed. And so if you get a Camp David or any Oslo Accords, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, look, we have peace. And yet you read what they're saying. Arafat himself, you recall, he even pointed out, he said, this is the Hudaybah, just like was a precedent with Muhammad, where he basically made a treaty with the pagans. And then when the time came, he was strong enough, he used an excuse to break it and went on a jihad and conquered them. And so it mind boggles me how we have so many precedents. We have all the connections, the dots are connected, and they're saying it. I mean, I wish they weren't even, if I said they're always lying, and they're dissembling, like the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, yeah.
You can say, all right, well, yeah, but the Salafi group, this is why I always say people listen to the Salafis, because these are the guys who are the most forthright people about the true teachings of Islam. They have no shame, and they'll say it, and you hear them, and the things they say are way worse than anything you and I can say they say. And yet
Absolutely.
and here it is from their own mouth, and nobody, it's again, it's that arrogance. No, it's ironic. It's like a vicious circle. It's almost like the worse a Muslim acts, the more intolerant, the more vicious he becomes, the more that prompts the West to say he has a true grievance.
Yes.
Oh, look how really angry he is. Therefore, we got to do more to make him happy. And
Yeah.
so, and then it's amazing, because then the more the West does, the more that really earns contempt from Muslims, because they see this, a kind of servile, giving in, appeasing, and that just makes them more demands, more violence, which then makes the West feel like it has to give in more. And it's absurd.
It is indeed. And it's amazing how you're saying that we have all this. It's all out there. They're saying it openly. And these things are not new. You mentioned the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and that sets the framework for all Islamic treaties, according to Islamic law, ever after that. And that was when Muhammad, in a position of weakness, concluded a treaty with the pagan Quraysh, and it was for 10 years. And then he broke it when he was strong enough and didn't need it anymore. And so it is part of Islamic law now that you can make a treaty for a period of up to 10 years if you are in a position of weakness and need to gather your strength to fight again more effectively. And yet, again and again and again, Western analysts, and especially in regard to Israel and the Palestinian jihadis, they invoke the idea that we can make a truce as if it's going to be a truce in Western terms, as if both sides equally want peace, and both sides will use the time of the truce to try to hammer out some kind of more effective and more lasting peace agreement, when actually this has never been the understanding of the truce in the Islamic world ever since the traditions about Muhammad were formulated. And it's astonishing, really, that the willful ignorance and the blindness on the part of the American military and intelligence community.
It's just it's really sad. And I mean, I was watching an Egyptian program and the other day, and they made a very good point, which I think is applicable to us in the West. And as you know, in Egypt, you have the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis, and they have their strong agenda and they're in power. And then you have the more liberal, secular, nominal Muslims and Copts and others who are resisting. And so a lot of these programs, I watch them that are, from the secular, like the Bassem Youssef type people. And one guy just the other day, he basically said, I mean, we, as in the Egyptian secular media, are telling you every day what they're doing, what they're up to, which is just the stuff we're talking about. And you, the viewers, a lot of you, of course, sympathize and you don't like it, but they continue doing it anyway. And it's gotten to the point where so it's like you and I, we say, we do, we write, we document, we expose, and people a lot in America and elsewhere sympathize, agree, and yet the government does what it's going to do, and it just keeps going. And it's very frustrating in that sense, because it's gotten to the point where it's a dictatorship. I mean, we know that in the Islamic world, but it's becoming that basically in the U.S., where you have a group, an administration that it just has its own agenda, its own belief, and the whole, no matter who's against it, no matter the evidence, all they have to do is say, oh no, that's a misunderstanding, or that's a hoax, and they just do their own thing. So it's gotten to the point, and that's why I really ultimately think we need something more than to just document facts. I mean, we need to actually change, as monumental a task as it sounds, the Western worldview, because until that's corrected, no matter how much evidence is given, it's just going to somehow either be rationalized, ignored, distorted. But once you have, and this is why I always say this global Islam problem would be a non-problem if common sense was actually in work. And this is why during the colonial era, when Europe became a lot stronger than the Islamic world, Islam, it was over. Muslims, you know what they wanted to do? To become like the West. Mm-hmm. Their whole thing was, how can we emulate the victorious West? Why is that? Because Muslims respect power. That is the whole story of Islam. Might makes right, and Islam is the embodiment of might. I join Islam, I become more powerful, I'm better than the dhimmi, I'm enriched, I have plunder, I have slaves, whatever the case may be. And then when they got defeated, starting really with Napoleon in 1798, Battle of Pyramids, what happened then is actually a turning towards the West. But why was that? Because the West at the time actually respected its own self, was proud of its own ways, and it didn't apologize for them, because there was no multiculturalism at that point. So when Muslims saw this, they actually sought to emulate it. And this is the golden age era for Christians, for example. Let's say around between 1850 till recent, or 1950 or so, this is when Muslims didn't have the beards anymore, and this is when they started wearing suits, and this is when they started becoming very Western oriented and really copying the West. But then what happened is, far from becoming this something to aspire to and to look up to, the West started loathing itself, hating itself, lost its own moral restraint, and that only caused the Muslim world actually to begin having contempt for the West and going back to its own roots. And so that's kind of what we're seeing. But this is why I'm saying, if you go back a couple of hundred years ago, I mean, this problem would not even exist without anyone doing anything. Why? Because the West actually was governed by a different set of principles, and it had a very different worldview, one that did not appease, one that did not denigrate its own values, one that did not praise others. And now that it's doing all that, all it's doing is earning contempt and disgust from Muslims, and validation. Basically validation that, yeah, we're doing the right thing. Look, even the West is telling us to do this. And so this is really the situation where we're at, where we've gotten to the point, truth, facts, documents. Hey, I mean, we can have mountains. We do have mountains, and they still don't do much because there's something wrong up here.
Yeah, no doubt about that. So how do we get back, Raymond? This is the eternal question, and I don't know that there's any easy answer, but in our time remaining, maybe we can try to sketch out some things. I mean, I couldn't agree more. Your analysis is spot on, that the West has lost its self-confidence, lost its sense of self, lost its way, lost respect for the Judeo-Christian civilization, lost respect for the universal principles of human rights that it gave to the world and that are accepted around the world, except in Sharia states and in the Islamic world generally. How do we get back? What can we do now to try to stem this tide and turn the direction back around?
Well, I believe what we can do is what you and I and many others do, of course, is just continue exposing, spreading the word, engaging in activism, because the more you do that, the more you get. And that's the whole point. I'm not really blaming Americans as much, because a lot of them, of course, see things the way we see it. A lot of them, that is to say, still have common sense. But the problem is we have this, these powers. We have academia, we have the media, we have the government, and they're the ones who have the ultimate voice. And all of them are on the other side, really. Okay, not all, but basically, in general, they're the ones that are propagating this myth, this alternate reality. So basically, I think, we do what we got to do, but I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, because historically, when people become decadent, it takes nothing. They have to be attacked. And we did get attacked on 9/11. And we had flags, American flags on our cars for a week. And now it's gone, and now it's forgotten. And now it's our fault again. So I think what's going to have to get, this is not what I want, but I think it's going to continue going the way it's going until you probably do have a caliphate and you do have an offensive. And you got to understand, and here's another thing about, the jihadi mentality. We always think of the balance of power. So I have nuclear powers, you have nuclear powers, but we love life. We're not going to use them until absolute worst scenario. But as you know, as jihadis love to boast, we love death as you love life, and I believe that. And so when these groups have these weapons, they will use it because these are people whose mentality is so much different than ours, in that they actually are out to bring the Mahdi. They're out to see, to have it so that every Jew behind the tree is being killed because the tree is exposing him. They believe this. This is not just something that is this thing. So that's what I think will eventually probably happen. They're going to continue getting stronger. People like you and I and many others will continue exposing and saying what's going on. The vast majority are being fed by the mainstream media, and the government will just be like, going along with that narrative until another. See, 9/11 was just the beginning, okay? But I think a lot of Muslims and jihadis understood that it was actually it was wrong. It was a wrong timing because it enabled people like you and me to start doing what we're doing, in that people woke up for a little bit. But I think what's going to happen now is more of the stealth jihad, which you know so well, and that's going to be going on for a while and this is what's going on. The Arab Spring is the stealth jihad, and trying to basically unify and then have the caliphate. And then once they are ready, you'll have that major offensive jihad we were talking about. And then hopefully at that point, people will be able to make a difference. I hate to be so pessimistic, but I really,
the
this is how
situation is what it is.
Yeah.
I don't think that sugarcoating it gets us anywhere. A lot of times when I speak around the country, people say, can't you give us anything encouraging? Can't you end up with a positive note? And, I understand the desire for that, but it's also a temptation to console oneself with half-truths and distortions just because they're more pleasant to deal with than the realities. I don't think that the free people are down for the count, or that free civilizations are going to vanish from the earth. I think that you're absolutely right, personally, that it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, and that we have an uphill battle. But it ain't over till it's over, as the great philosopher Yogi Berra said. And the thing is that the Islamic world is also so weak and brittle. Look, for example, at the fury against people who tell the truth about Islam, at the desperate attempts to shut us down. And this manifests a tremendous insecurity, as if they know that what we're saying is true, and they're desperate to avoid being exposed. That is not the sign of a confident culture striding into victory. And so, it's not as if all is lost here by any means, because the Western openness to questioning and to investigation, I think, is always going to win out against this thuggish suppression of free inquiry.
No, I agree with you. And again, that's why I differentiate, people, the Americans and Westerners. My understanding, if you really think about it, I think I saw a poll, or I don't know how accurate, but I think most people agree with our view about it. The question is, are they in a position to make a difference? And that's the problem. Exactly. So, it's a difference between we know and we want to, and then there's the powers that be who are not, and this is the problem. How we're gonna. So it's probably gonna get. It's gonna get into. I don't want to say a civil war, but there's going to be a very vast ideological divide in America, much more than it is now. I don't even consider it a divide, really. But there's going to be such a different worldview that there's going to be a conflict, because, as you know, the liberals are not going to give it up either. They're not just because they're the most ones who, for all the peace and tolerance and multiculturalism they speak, as I pointed out, they do the exact opposite. So they will have no compunction of engaging in violence just to stay in power. And how will they justify it? They're doing it for the good of humanity. It's a Marxist mentality, kind of.
Absolutely. So, very much so.
Yeah.
Look at Obama. We've been talking a lot about Obama's attachment to Islam, but there's also no doubt that throughout his career, starting with his announcement of his very first political campaign in Bill Ayer's living room, he has been associated with radical Marxists, communists, and this doesn't seem to be any problem for him. And so we see, in a certain sense, his presidency as the embodiment of the alliance between the left and Islamic supremacism that expresses itself in so many ways around the world and in the United States today.
And part of my pessimism is from the fact that he got elected again. So
Yeah.
you would have thought that, okay, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, it's kind of shame on me.
Oh,
So, and
absolutely.
that's the situation we're at. And what bothers me, and you know this too, is a lot of the conservatives and Republicans, they're really following the same narrative, and they'll be a smidgen better, but it's the same idea. I mean, how
Oh,
many
yeah.
really conservative politicians are on full board with sort of the thing that we're presenting here? I know there are
Very
some,
few. There
but
are
the
some, but
overwhelming
very few. You're
majority,
right.
yeah, very few. So
So one
even
thing we can,
the
Raymond, we're
alternative,
about out of time, but one thing we can
okay,
leave at the as a takeaway from this, I hope that all of you watching this will keep it in mind that this should be something you should be pressuring your elected officials about, alert them to the Muslim persecution of Christians, demand that they speak about it in Congress and the Senate. This is something that we have to do because they're not doing it, and we have to make sure that they do or that they be held accountable at the ballot box. And if we don't do
right.
this, then one thing we can be sure of is that things are not going to get better. Raymond Ibrahim, it's been a great pleasure to have you here. Be sure to get Raymond's book, Crucified Again, a vitally important book today. And this has been ABN's Jihad Watch program. I'm Robert Spencer. Thank you for watching. Good night, and God bless.